Hungry Trilobyte podcast would like to start by acknowledging these fine conventions. The Hellmouth Con. The Hellmouth Convention is back, and it's hosting a spectacular event in the place of all places, Torrance High School, the shooting location for Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Join us June 15th, 2024 for one day only. Proceeds benefit the Los Angeles LGBT Center and the Ron Glass Memorial Scholarship. Visit thehellmouth.org for details. SoonerCon 32. Oklahoma City's longest running premier pop culture convention returns June 21st through 23rd, 2024. Prepare for 3 days of cosplay, crafts, tabletop gaming, and legendary guests, all in the friendly town of Norman, Oklahoma. To give back to the community, fundraisers and a live charity auction will be held. Visit SoonerCon.com to reserve your membership. On tap today, we have Chris Totten. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing well. Hope you're doing well as well.
I am. I am really excited to talk to you because I have been having a good time with this game you've designed called Kudzu. Or is it Kudzu?
That depends on where you're from.
Okay.
Up here in Ohio, I say kudzu, but I know down south they say kudzu.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, my northeastern Pennsylvania brain says Kudzu, but that's just me. And I have to say, I love this game because it is an homage to one of my all-time favorite games, The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening. There's a very clear path between that game and what you've created, and yet your game is, I would say, as well designed, but it also has its own taste, so it doesn't feel like a complete ripoff.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Mhm. I thought very, very carefully because I'm trying to think, okay, I like this, but I like it because it is its own thing. It's not a
Right.
level pack.
Right. And it's funny because like there's a lot of one of the reasons I wanted to like get it done from a purely production standpoint. And I'm gonna go talking about the like motivations and all the like
Mhm.
the creative fun stuff in a second, but like from a pure production timeline standpoint, I saw that the GB Studio Game Boy homebrew scene was definitely going towards the direction of like a lot of Zelda likes. Um, and I was like, okay, we got to get this out, because these are coming.
Mhm.
But as you pointed out, I think, yeah, one of the things that I really wanted to do. And like there's some really direct things like there's a alligator character and some of the other things. But one of these I really wanted to make sure it was not just like elves and swords and sorcery. And again, I love that. I'm a Zelda fanboy.
Mhm.
But I definitely wanted to give it its own sort of flavor so that the world stood apart, even though you could kind of look at something and be like, "Oh yeah, that's kind of like this other thing."
And I find it so interesting that you just said that there are so many of these games either here or coming, and I'm glad they are because I'm totally on
Yeah,
board for this. But when it was new, Link's Awakening was this very odd special thing in the Game Boy library because up until then the Game Boy games tended to be very short, quick, snappy experiences, and it
yeah,
wasn't necessarily the first big game, but it was one of the first notable big games.
right. It was kind of you know, like Mario Land. I mean, Mario Land is like very small, but
Mhm.
Mario Land 2 was like it was big, but it wasn't as big, and it was weird. It was different in a lot of
Mhm.
ways, and it seemed still like a bit compromised. It's not that compromised. It's like very polished and nice. I love Mario Land 2 a lot just because it is like Mario can fight a vampire exactly once. That's weird. Anyway, like cool, that kind of fun stuff. Like I love that game so much. But yeah, like Link's Awakening is like this isn't even like you were trying to make the Nintendo one. You were trying to like make the Super Nintendo and you kind of succeeded and exceeded it in certain ways,
Mhm.
right? And yeah, like the work that they did you'd mentioned taking inspiration from it and some of the things that I wanted to make sure I at least got right were the mood, the vibe of the world and somebody actually I was talking to a few weeks ago commented on, like, I balanced the cute and the creepy really well. And that's one of the things that, like, I've always had, like, a kind of morbid, uh, undertone to, like, my sensibilities and the sense of humor and my but, uh, like, with a very, like, wholesome seeming exterior, but I do like, occasionally, like, I love Edward Gorey and, like, those cartoonists like him, Charles Addams, like the Addams
Mm.
Family.
Mm-hmm.
I love that sort of stuff, and so, like, having a game like Kudzu where I can kind of exercise that a little bit, not to, plug the other project, too much. I mean, there's time for that. But like, so I'm also working on another game, a more traditional modern indie title called Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, based on the original Winsor McCay Little Nemo comic strip from 1905 that like the NES game was based on. Well, that the movie that inspired the NES game was based on. It's kind of a row of dominoes there. But like that cartoonist, Winsor McCay, he had the same thing. He has a comic called Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, which is like really funny and actually kind of holds up pretty well, except for, it's 1905, the not great depictions of other cultures from time to time. But like there's stuff in it where it is just this like little twist at the end where you're like, ooh, and that kind of, dark undertone. And I think that was a lot of fun to work with. So yeah, it's like um I wanted to get that right. And I wanted to, so I like did what the Link's Awakening team is like, oh, if they were inspired by Twin Peaks, I'm gonna rewatch all of Twin Peaks, right? And kind of did that sort of tone setting. And then the other thing that I wanted to make sure I got right was really just, I mean, I played a lot of Takashi Tezuka directed games for that because I wanted to really, and I'm a game design academic. I work at a university. I work at Kent State in Ohio, and I teach game development there. And you know, I really wanted to sit down and analyze that, like what he does and like what a Takashi Tezuka type design felt like, and be like, okay, how can I kind of do some of the similar thing? If I could get that spirit right, then it's like then everything else can kind of like be the nods. People may not necessarily like know that I'm doing that, but like it'll feel somewhat in the right area, right?
Let's swing back to Nemo in a minute because I
Yeah.
definitely want to talk about that. But what
Yeah.
I mean, something you just said really struck a chord with me. I've said on this show many times, I'm not a horror fan per se.
Right.
I'm not the guy who wants to go see the latest Freddy movie or whatever. That's not my cup of tea. I love people who do that. But I do like the macabre, I guess is the
Yeah.
word, or I do
Yeah.
like the creepy. And
Yeah.
that, like when you talk about something like the Addams Family, where the aesthetics tend to be very light and cute, but what they're talking about gets to be very grisly. It's like you see the cuteness, but in the theater of the mind, you're just like, oh, that's not cute at all what they just said. The juxtaposition, I love that.
Right. Yeah. Like we play what's that game? It's over here. Gloom, at home, right? And that's kind of fun because it's like, you know, if you've never played Gloom, it's a card game, but all the cards are clear plastic, and it is that sort of Edward Gorey at like Addams Family kind of humor where basically what you're trying to do is you have a family and you're trying to kill off the entire family, but to get the most points for killing off the entire family, you have to make them as miserable as possible. So that's where the clear cards come in. The bottom card is their portrait, and then the top, like you play cards on top that have little score spots on them. So you put down that card and the score spot will come up, and whatever is visible from like the top of the stack is the score you get for that family member. But then you can play cards on each other like, but they got happily married, and then so like that will block some of the dots because there's like four little like rows of dots. So you can like, yeah, it's a really well constructed game. Like the actual like thing is really good because of this clear plastic gimmick. But you know, turning it into this storytelling game where it is again like that Addams Family, Edward Gorey, that sort of mindset is really lovely. But again, it's like that line, you know,
Mhm.
like you said, and especially after having kids, because I used to watch horror movies all the time and play lots of horror video games. After having kids, I'm like a total wuss now. I'll be like, that looks like a good movie to read the Wikipedia entry for later. You know, like all this stuff A24 is putting out. I'm like, I don't know.
And like even to go back to Link's Awakening for a minute, there were so many cases in that where if you're the kind of person who reads all the dialogue and follows the little side quests, like, there would always be this little creepy, not I don't want to say creepy, but slightly maybe upsetting subtext to anything some of the characters were talking about.
Right, it's kinda like existential, like,
Hmm.
once you I don't think this is a spoiler anymore, but spoilers for anybody who hasn't, you know, played Link's Awakening all the way through. It's a dream, and you are essentially, like, eliminating these people from existence by waking up, but you have to wake up because Link is floating on a board in the ocean, right?
Hmm.
And thus, like that presents an entirely other existential crisis. And, but when you think about that, you're like, oh no, the people are gonna be gone if you wake up. But then, yeah, if you think about like, wait a minute, where's Link though? You're like,
Hmm.
oh, so dark. And it's dark already. But yeah, it's like, wow, you know, that is incredible. And again, like you can really see the um I think what they described as like the Lynch influence, the David Lynch influence from, you know, because Twin Peaks at the time was like really popular in Japan
Hmm.
to the point where they had like um Kyle MacLachlan like fly over and do commercials for like canned coffee. Um and like a bunch of the other cast members. But I think it was like a town of suspicious people was like kind of what they was the thing where like really manifests in that
Hmm.
game, especially. And you can totally see that. And again, like that's one of the things that I really wanted to play around with was like I played that. I watched that. I played Link's Awakening, of course, but I'd also like recently not motivated by making Kudzu, but just like I got around to playing Earthbound again, and I was
Uh-huh.
like, "Yeah, this fits." And like that's where you have like I mean, I don't know where you are in Kudzu. I'm gonna drop some spoilers,
That's fine. That's
maybe.
fine.
But like, you know, when you go to the state and you go and you talk to the ghosts who are pretending to be the house staff, that's why they're like weird. And if you like talk to them several times, like they'll say different things. Like they'll be kind of like they'll kind of lose they'll start forgetting their lines of like how they're supposed to be acting human and or they'll just kind of like start freaking out and they'll be like, whoa, you know, like yeah, and start doing not like a lot, just you know a few here and there, but enough to like give it a little bit of weirdness. And then other things like you know there's a character in like the forest who's a bug and he's blocking the roadway and you have to get him out of the roadway by going and progressing the story and he'll be like uh oh, you're the number 3 human I've seen today. And then if you talk to him more, he'll like up through I think 9, he will tell you you're the number 9 human I've seen today. The implication is supposed to be that he sees humans, but he can't actually distinguish them from one another.
Hmm.
So he just like assumes you're a different person, even though you've talked to him a million times. But then he also really loves blocking the road. So when when the mayor says, "Oh, I'll tell him to stop blocking the road," he'll be so disappointed. It's just those little things, right?
Hmm.
It's like that's the I wanted that like these people are kind of goofy. They're kind of goofballs, but they're all really into whatever they're into. That's the other thing. They're all like nerds for whatever they're into, and I like it.
It's characters you can relate to.
Right? Yeah. Like I wanted what's our equivalent of the guy who says like I'm totally going to be lost in the mountains later, and then he is.
Yeah.
Yeah, love it.
Now, when we talked about your project with Little Nemo, you're going to be set. There's going to be a display at the Chicago Game Space, if I understand correctly.
Yes, I will not be able to be there. But yeah, no, Chicago Game Space reached out to me. And I've known Jonathan from there for a few years, working on different games and art initiatives. And then I've been involved with the Chicago-based VGA Gallery on their board of directors, which again he got me hooked up with, and I a lot of those folks are also involved in Bitbash, which has been around and doing amazing things for years and years, and I've gotten to know some of them. But then years ago, they showed another one of my games called Laziski's Revenge at Art Institute Chicago, which was like a huge honor, right? Very prestigious institution. But yeah, so Chicago Game Space, Little Nemo is going to be there, and it's going to be showcased next to original, like prints of, not like the original Winsor McKay's, but prints of Winsor McKay's original comics that have been licensed from the Billy Ireland Museum, Cartoon Museum in Columbus, Ohio. So that's gonna be wild. And then some of my comics that I made, my own Little Nemo comics that I made as concept art for our game are going to be next to those Windsor McKays. So it's like, wow, that's
Yeah.
that's huge. Yeah, I'm really excited about it.
I'm going to be there in about 3 weeks. I'm really looking forward to seeing this.
Oh, take pictures.
No, totally. I totally will.
um, yeah, so like I guess I should probably also explain like what that game is. So Little Nemo and the Nightmare Fiends, for anybody who hasn't seen it around, it's a 2D hand animated. In fact, on my other screen here, I have a drawing tablet screen. I'm working on one of the bosses right now, on one of the Nightmare Fiends actually. But the premise is that it's a hand animated Metroidvania ish adjacent adventure, where you are Nemo, a little boy who can go on adventures in his dreams, and you can play as three of his friends: the Princess of Slumberland, Flip, the mischievous clown, and a character we created for the game called Peony, who's a sort of like, you know, special forces royal guard type character. But basically, each of these characters have their own fighting abilities and platforming abilities, and they can be swapped between at any time to reach new areas or create platforming combos. This is where like the Metroidvania ishness comes in. But it's based on the original Little Nemo comics. It's drawn to look like the original Little Nemo comics, and uses a bunch of characters from those comic books and things, or from the comic strips, in this sort of like big adventure. It's taken a long time to make, but that's the thing when you make a hand animated game. But yeah, I mean, we're chugging along. We're putting out pretty frequent updates, and appearing at stuff like Chicago Game Space. We're also going to have a demo up at Too Many Games in Philly, at the end of June as well. So yeah, I mean that's been a fantastic project to work with, and a fantastic IP to work with. Public domain's great.
Sure. I mean, most people who are listening to this probably aren't going to be super familiar with the original source
Right.
material from the beginning of the 1900s. I think it's a great read. I haven't done a deep dive into it, but every time I find those comics, I just read them for about an hour, and I really have a good time with them.
Yeah.
If you're not familiar with the original NES game, it was really popular for a hot minute.
Yeah. And
Uh,
it still gets like brought up every once in a while. So for those who aren't familiar with the NES game, there was a movie in 1989, or I guess we got it in like 1992 or something like that,
Mhm.
called Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland. And it's itself kind of an interesting piece of animation history. Not because it like well, it's an interesting piece of animation history because it was such a train wreck that involved so many famous people. Um, and those famous people got fed up and then took some of the work that they had done, notably like Hayao Miyazaki of Studio Ghibli. Like he went and he was originally on this movie and was working on it, had a bunch of ideas, and he didn't like the production. And this is like in the early 80s. It came out in the late 80s. They'd been working on this for like a decade. He basically took his ball and went home, and that ball became Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, right? And we have some homages to Nausicaa in our game for that connection. But then like a kind of a rotating door of people came through and were working on it. Eventually came out. It premiered the same weekend as Kiki's Delivery Service in Japan, and lost Tokyo Movie Shinsa so much money that they had to basically spend the next 10 years or so doing contract work for Warner Brothers over here, to pay the bills. That's why we have
Mhm.
great looking episodes of Tiny Toon Adventures, Batman the Animated Series, free like up through like Freakazoid and I think Hysteria, but like all those the like that Warner television like
Mhm.
golden age in the 90s, they were involved in that because Little Nemo did not do well.
I
So
did not
yeah,
know that.
that's why see, this is all the stuff, I'm an academic, so I kind of like in approaching Little Nemo, I like became kind of an academic of Little Nemo and Winsor McKay. But yeah, this is the kind of stuff that like we picked up, that when we did these deep dives, we wanted to really understand all of these pieces of source material. Anyway, that movie came out, and Capcom was asked to make an NES game of it. And it's a pretty good NES game.
Mhm.
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
It's pretty decent.
It's usually compared to Super Mario Brothers 3, which is a very complimentary comparison. I'm not sure
Yeah.
it's apt because they're both excellent games, but I just don't necessarily compare them very well together.
It's a weirdly, and I always have to be careful here because like I know some people like this is like their favorite NES game, right? Like
Mhm.
I guess it's not my favorite NES game. Actually, Mario 3 is.
Mhm.
Um, Mario 3 is one of my favorite games of all time, which again, Takashi Tezuka. Um, like, and Kudzu really brought out, to go back to Kudzu and Takashi Tezuka, deep diving on that design really brought out how influential he is on how I view game design. And it was like, wow, it's so great to actually, I'm not making a Mario 3 game, but, or like, but it is like something that was, understanding Mario 3 better through like an analytical lens.
Mhm.
And Link's Awakening, which is probably my favorite of the 2D Zeldas, really helped me sit down and be like, wow, this uh, he has such like a direct influence on how I design that I wasn't even like consciously thinking about. And then I started consciously trying to do a Takashi Tezuka riff. And then it was like, okay, now I'm kind of trying to master this technique that I feel like I've been kind of mentally preparing for my whole life of making video games, which is really fun. Um, but yeah, like Nemo gets compared to Mario 3. I I don't know if that's apt. I think the sort of like sharpness of the art and its clarity is very much like it. I think in terms of game design, it's a little schizophrenic in a way, and not so because like, the levels are weird, because the levels are what they are. I think the levels are gorgeous and really
Mhm.
cool, and actually capture McKay's originals better than I remembered they did. Like I did a playthrough recently and I was like, wow, okay, so there's Befuddle Hall. It's like the upside down level because that's in the comics. Um, flower gardens are in the comics. Mushroom Forest is in the comics. Like there's a lot of stuff that's in those comics. Riding animals and wearing them as skin suits, not in the comics. Um, but you can kind of tell like Capcom probably had a game that they were working on that they were handed this license and they're like, so those mechanics. Okay, cool. Um, that's what it feels like to me. But it's also a weirdly, I think, schizophrenic game because there's there's levels where like so the structural element of the game for those who haven't played is that Little Nemo must feed candy to certain animals, and then he can use their abilities either like by riding them or wearing them as a kind of weird skin suit. Um, like the frog one, he looks like the Mario frog suit, but the frog is asleep, so it's like,
Hmm.
oh, how do you get in there? If you don't think about it too much,
Yeah, no,
uh,
no, no.
don't think about it. Again,
Yeah.
that the jokes where it's like if you think about it too hard, then it gets weird.
It's a
Um,
dream world for a reason.
Exactly. So, but you use their abilities to go and find keys. This is the part of the game that I think people like gloss over, but I think is actually like the more important part of the game is you have to find 6 keys in every level, and then that exploration is why the suits are there, and you have to go find the keys and then take them to the exit, and then it unlocks the 6 locks that are on the exit door. Um, and there's some levels that balance that really well. And then there's other levels where again, I think it's the most important. I think that's actually more important than the animal suits. The animal suits are really there to kind of serve this find the keys mechanic for exploration. But like they're my favorite level, which is the cloud city ruins, like totally forgets that mechanic. And at the end of the level, they're like, here's 6 keys. Like it's this wonderful platform, like auto scroll platforming level that does a great job. And then it goes, oh shoot, here's a bunch of keys, and then you get keys right in front of the exit door. And it makes me laugh every time because I'm like, oh, this game is so you can see the people making it kind of going, uh, here's 6 keys. You can kind of see inside the designer a little bit, and I love that about it. But yeah, I mean, there's other levels that like balance it really, really well. And then again, at the end of the game, there's just kind of like, forget the key. Here you can finally attack, and you're like, what? And then the game becomes this like kind of really cool Mega Man like, with like really neat bosses. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's all over the place, but it's got so many neat ideas, and you can kind of see how the ideas are like rolling around in the designers' heads.
The NES, for the people who have, it's like they're just going back to that system among many others. They might not get that that was a system where the technology had advanced to the point where you could have lots of really cool ideas, but you didn't always realize the limitations until you were about two-thirds of the way through making the game. And then
Yeah.
you had to find ways to make what you wanted happen. You had to shoehorn it into the design that was there. And
Hmm.
some games did that way better than others.
Yeah, and there was like I think people were still coming to terms with the idea that games could be more than a single screen,
Mhm.
and like, when by 92 they had that more or less figured out and it was Capcom. But I think yeah, you still see that in some games where they're figuring out that balance and that sense of game design. It's not as ingrained yet,
Mhm.
and it is in some cases. Like, I mean, you can start to see things with like, like Mega Man's an example. The creator of Mega Man um would always talk about the designer creator, not Inafune, but uh what's his name? I can't remember the other guy's name. Not Inafune, but the other guy, the actual like programmer designer of Mega Man. Um he he would talk about how he would do waves of enemies, and it would always be like in 3 sets, and it would be like the first one is kind of a challenge, the second one escalates the challenge, and then the third one is the easiest, so that after making it through round 2 you feel like you achieve something by getting an easy round encounter of enemies, and then that makes you feel good about yourself. And I was like, see, that's when they were trying to, that's when like that language and that sense was starting to get kind of figured out, um, apart from like some of the more arcade single screen based things that you would have like in the late 70s, early 80s.
As opposed to something like, I'm going to pick on Bayou Billy for a minute, where the idea was once we have this really great enemy design, let's just throw 20 of them at you at once.
Right.
That equals fun. And the
Yeah.
rules, and it doesn't. But you might not have known that till you tried.
Right. And yeah, I mean, you had like some of these other, yeah, they would try to be like throw things into the game to try to, yeah, like you said, oh, I've got this really cool design. Let's keep throwing them at the player, and you're like, ugh. Some of them are really hard to go back to. Um, like my kids have a hard time going back to NES games. I have the the AVS, the like
Hmm.
the FPGA system that you can use to like play NES games on a HD TV.
Hmm.
And it's actually great because it comes with an internal Game Genie. So I'll just turn on all the cheats for them, like the ones that make sense,
Hmm.
not every single cheat, but I'll like say, oh yeah, infinite lives code, here you go, and then they get to actually enjoy them without worrying about, like you said, yeah, like Bayou Billy just totally like annihilating you with too much stuff, and they get to kind of like enjoy that for what it is, and then yeah, like master them, and then maybe take off the training wheels on it.
That is a really good way to play those games. And I don't care what skill level you are, sometimes just to practice, the cheats can be really helpful.
Mhm.
And that's been something that even when I first got the Game Genie, and I didn't want to use it when I was actually trying to get good, but just to understand the concept of, how to practice just the techniques, being able to try over and over again without having to replay the same three levels. I think that I would say that it should have been built in some of those games, but we can see where some opportunities were missed.
Well, and at the time they were trying to combat, you know, like the rental market, right?
Hmm.
The idea that you would beat the game in the weekend. So now I think it makes sense for us going back to them. But yeah, I mean, I can see from like a developer standpoint why at the time. The other thing too is like a lot of us were playing those games when we were kids, and so it was like you got this game and it was your game for the weekend.
Hmm.
There isn't an app store to be like, well, this is too hard. I'm going to go play like this other game that came out, or the other like giant library of games. I think that's one of the things that my kids definitely fall to, but I also definitely fall to, is that sort of like, well, how much do I want to spend time with this one game and devote all my time to it when I have a whole library to browse? And
Hmm.
not even just, like from my list of retro games on my analog pocket, with the different cores. Like if I have a list of NES games, like, oh well, I'll have like one little error, and they'll be like, oh, screw it, I'm gonna play this. Just because I can just like go between games, and I'm like, why am I not trying to just like master? Like there are times when I feel like sitting down and mastering them, but then there are times where I'm like, let me go check something else out. And we definitely do that on the Switch too. That can be kind of the problem, is like I have this wall of games now on the Switch, and it's like uh I I do that, they do it. Um but it is nice, yeah. Like the nice thing about the cartridge, even with the cheats, is that it's like I have to, even though I have like a library of NES games, it is nice because it's like this one cartridge contains one game, and I'm going to like spend my time with this one game, and that's kind of nice to go back to.
We had a conversation with Frank Spaldi a while back that basically came down to saying, I'm simplifying it, the act of taking a physical cartridge and putting it in a physical system kind of commits you to playing that game for a decent amount of time. You can't flip away to something else 30 seconds later because you're going to feel like you didn't get anything out of it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
we're so used to just flipping between apps and having that short experience that sometimes, even though it's the same game as it would be emulated, the fact that you made yourself do that puts you in the mindset of this is what I'm going to do for the next hour.
Well, and to kind of take it back to like Kudzu, by not taking it back to Kudzu at all,
Mhm.
but taking it back to another game that was published by 8-Bit Legit, Full Quiet. So like I actually have my Full Quiet box like over there. Love that game. So Retrotainment Games put out their homebrew game called Full Quiet. It's a Metroidvania is really not a good word for this one. But it is this like open world exploratory game in like I would describe it as like, hills in Appalachia, um, in like, in rural PA or something like that. That's the vibe I get from it. Like Western PA.
I can fact
And
check you on that.
huh?
I said I can fact check you on that.
I mean they're from that area, so I'm
Mhm.
like, might be where they're that might be what it is. It's at least like West Virginia-ish. But it's definitely like you are you're exploring this world and like so I have it on Switch. I have it on Steam and it's glorious in all those modes. But like there was just something about having it in my AVS, which is my NES, right? I mean, I have my NES too, but like this was in my family room on my HD TV.
Mhm, mhm,
Like, there's just something about having it on the NES that is it's just so nice and
mhm.
so comforting. That like again, I was loving it on Switch, and I like having it on Steam, and I like having that where if it's like I'm elsewhere and I feel like playing it, then I'm like, oh, I'm gonna pop it in. I'm gonna put it on the Switch because like maybe I have the Switch with me and I'm traveling or something like that. But yeah, no, I mean it was a much nicer experience to commit to with that cartridge just because it was like the whole thing, right?
So let's talk Kudzu for just a second there. It is
Yeah.
available on Switch as well as physical Game Boy cartridge.
Yes.
Is anything else?
There are we have discussed going on Steam and Xbox. I I don't personally have any updates on that. That's kind of 8-Bit Legit is handling some of those, but I know that the intention is to go onto some of those platforms. So stay tuned on those.
Mhm.
Mostly because like those are other platforms that they have served through some of their other games. So those have been discussions that we've had regarding that. Uh, yeah.
And Little Nemo, do you know what direction that's going in right now, or is it still a little too early to talk that?
We've committed to Steam and Switch at least.
Okay.
Yeah, and then I mean, we're using Unity, so and I don't want to give anybody the impression that like we snap our fingers and it magically appears on. Oh, holding a Q-tip. That's because I actually, speaking of old carts, I need to go clean a cartridge after
Mhm.
this. Um, but we had uh I don't want to give anybody the impression that we snap our fingers, then it's like PlayStation compatible or something like that. But yeah, I mean, we're talking. We don't really have anything we can fully like announce at this point.
Uh, Starting from Unity, it's not as much of a journey as I understand it.
Right. There are when you work with Unity, so Unity the game engine for anybody who may or may not know in the listenership, basically you can from the console manufacturers get and from Unity get a extension of the engine that will create a build compatible with that console. Now, when you're doing any conversion to any console from any other console, you are dealing with frame rate issues, compatibility issues. That one script that ran really well is suddenly making a crash bug. Uh, all this stuff, right? So you have to almost kind of like thoroughly test to make sure it is fully functional and not glitching out on the other platform with its like other architecture and fun stuff like that.
And where can people find you and your adventures and maybe your next project after Nemo?
You can find me. I'm on Twitter at Totter87. You can my website for some of the game development stuff is pfbstudios.com. So pie for breakfast studios, pfbstudios.com. You can get Kudzu at Megacat Studios. They have that on their website. And then 8-Bit Legit did the Kudzu port. And yeah, like Little Nemo's available to wishlist on Steam right now. So yeah.
Okay, well, Chris, thank you so much for being here. I love Kudzu. I'm looking forward to Little Nemo like crazy, and I want to keep in touch with you after I get to the Chicago game space.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you very much for having me on. And yeah, like again, please send pictures of Nemo in the game space. I'd love to see them.
Absolutely, will do.
All right.
Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.